it's too early to tell. That's what much of this stuff about the internet. It's a brave new world we entered, and God help us all.
Have you ever sat back and looked at these books from a distance? They're very hard to read. You can't make out the words. They're too small. No, I meant figuratively. At least as far as the POV structure is concerned. I wasn't so sure about doing this video now, but it felt like a natural segue because a lot of it has to do with POVs again. You know, A Song of Ice and Fire focuses largely on a conflict between major houses. George writes this from third-person limited point of views, focusing largely on characters within those houses, as well as supporting characters who directly support the faction of a major house. So let's look at the major houses and how George introduces us to these characters within the story. So you have Will as the prologue beyond the wall, who isn't really related to any major house, but Will introduces us to Garrett, who later shows up in Bran's chapter when Bran Stark is introduced. And in Bran's chapter, we're introduced to Eddard, we're introduced to Jon, and also Theon, who becomes a POV later. And of course, Bran also mentions his mother, Catelyn, who becomes a POV in just a couple of chapters. Now I know what you're all thinking, because you're seeing her not grouped under the Starks. You're thinking, why is he pronouncing her Catelyn and not Catelyn? Well, that's because I found a So Spake Martin and George says you're supposed to pronounce it Catelyn, not Catelyn. Surprise! No, she's over under the Tullys, because most of the female married POVs, they tend to relate more towards their house that they came from, rather than the house that they married into. Doesn't mean that she's not a Stark, same way that Jon is a Targaryen, but like, he doesn't know he's a Targaryen, so how can you say that he can relate at all to being a Targaryen? And Jon introduces us to Sansa and Arya, and also Tyrion later on. And then we get to Dany, who is introduced entirely separate of all the rest of the characters. Now in the show, they have a little bit of a lead-in here, where Ned and Robert are talking, and they're like, all the Targaryens are dead, and Robert's like, not all of them. But that's not in the books. And I think that was a choice on George's part to like emphasize the separation of the different worlds they lived in. And then in Book 2, we're introduced to the infamous Stannis Baratheon through the prologue of Cresson. Now, Cresson's not a Baratheon, at least not in his house, but he is in support of those characters, and he also introduces us directly into Davos. And then the next major house POV that's introduced is Jaime Lannister, who was introduced to us through Eddard and Jon all the way back in Book 1. And then Book 4 happens, and there is an explosion of POVs that just jump onto the scene immediately. We've got Cersei coming in at King's Landing. The Iron Isles, we have Aeron, we have Asha, and we have Victarion. And in Dorne, we've got Arianne and Arrow, and Aerys directly supporting Arianne. And that's not all. In the next book, we have Quentyn added to House Martell, and Melisandre gets a role for House Baratheon, and for the Targaryens, Barristan gets added, along with Jon Connington for the opposing Targaryen faction. And you might notice that somebody's missing. That's House Arryn. So where are the Aarons? Well, Jon Arryn dies at the start of the book, so obviously he can't be a POV. And Lysa Tully, well, she's more of a Tully, but she's too clued in on information because she knows who killed Jon Arryn because it was her. Can't make her a POV. That leaves us with just Sweet Robin. And some fans speculate that Sweet Robin might not be an Arryn at all. In fact, due to Jon Arryn's infertility, he might have hatched some sort of backdoor deal with Littlefinger to father an heir, because Lysa liked him. Of course, if that were the case, then it wouldn't be a backdoor deal at all. It would be a front door deal, but I don't know if that's true or not. The real reason why Sweet Robin's probably not a POV is, could you imagine what a Sweet Robin POV would look like?
I don't want to eat the food, I just want to have Elaine read me stories, but Meryl was keeping me up all night, and I just want to have Elaine next to me, but then they took my Elaine away from me.
Oh my god. Yeah, we're never getting that POV. So now we've accounted for all the major houses. Except for House Tyrell, I tricked you! There's one more! Although you should have known that, it's also up at the title. There's an entire house that has 0 representation, and it's not like they have no one around to fill it out. You've got Olenna, you have Mace, you have Margaery, you have Loras, you have Garland, and you have Mr. Puppy's Willis! Why don't they have any POVs? You got House Greyjoy over here with 4 of their prominent members with POVs, and the only ones who don't make the cut are Balon and Euron. Why do we have no Tyrells? Well, back in Book 2, you couldn't really make a Tyrell a POV because they're the big surprise at the end of the book of who they were now aligned with. so you really can't make any of them a POV. And Olenna in book 3, she knows too much, so she can't be a POV. But a lot of these other characters, they could be very fine POVs, but we don't get them. So why not? Did at one point we get them? Ooh. Well, that's a tough question to answer. And to do that, though, we're going to have to go back. We're going to have to re-examine something that we looked at before, but this time in a bit more detail. So you know the series starts out in 96 with A Game of Thrones, and then is followed up in 98 with A Clash of Kings, and then in 2000, Storm of Swords comes out. And George is working on the 4th book in the series called A Dance with Dragons, which is to then be followed up with by The Winds of Winter, and then the last book in the series at this time was not yet known as A Dream of Spring, it was still being called A Time for Wolves. And what a time it was. And there's a little kind of a space here. Well, that's because A Dance with Dragons wasn't A Dance with Dragons, it was A Dance with Dragons. What do I mean by that? Well, that's because there was the 5-year gap. George was planning to have 5 years take place between these two books, and a lot of the past 5 years would be covered in A Dance with Dragons through recollections of the characters, but for the most part, the entire story was going to jump forward 5 years. And then something happened. George ran into a bunch of struggles and realized this whole thing through recollections wasn't going to work, and that he was going to have to create a new book to take place during this 5 years. And so A Feast for Crows was born, and the entire book was going to span the time of about 5 years. At the same time, he also renamed A Time for Wolves into A Dream of Spring. And so George kept chugging ahead on the writing for A Feast for Crows, but the book wasn't spanning any more amount of time, and it kept growing and growing, and it wasn't skipping. Eventually, George declared that the 5-year gap was entirely dead. And then the book grew too big, and he had to split it apart. And then A Dance with Dragons became A Dance with Dragons as we know it, containing half of the story of A Feast for Crows with a little bit extra to be followed up with by The Winds of Winter. So where does that leave us? Well, it means we're going to have to go back and go in deeper. A deeper 5-year gap, if you will. Because we need to understand why this explosion of POVs ever happened, and why the Tyrells didn't get one, which means looking at a lot of primary sources, well, secondary sources, the best sources that we have available from that time. So we're back in the year 2000, and A Storm of Swords had a very strange release. It came out first in the UK because they had a publishing slot open, and as George puts it, they wanted to cash in on the international sales. Probably because the English just couldn't resist another opportunity to take from other countries what wasn't theirs. George is getting geared up for his big whirlwind release tour, and he answers a fan's questions in August. Have you started to Dance with Dragons yet?
Well, not the writing, but thinking about it, yes.
If not, do you have any idea when you will?
After Worldcon.
The book is churning in George's head. Fast forward a couple of months, and on October 9th, a fan named Omer got to meet up with George and reported in on what he found out.
I met him in Elstercon in Leipzig, East Germany, and I must say it was great. Martin was so nice. He actually remembered me from the emails, which was great. There were hardly any Leute da, and so I got to talk to him a lot. 2 tidbits for fans. There are going to be 2 new Wildcards books, as well as reissuing some of the oldies. And about A Dance with Dragons, Martin said that he could easily put in a new POV character, but he probably won't, because it'll make the book dicker, and he has to make A Dance with Dragons dinner and then A Storm of Swords. Omer.
And the same information is corroborated about a week later when George is in Frankfurt by somebody who reports in named Brosan? Is that Bronze censorship? What? But really, no new POV characters? You look at the map, and how is he going to tell the story of King's Landing? Was Jaime just going to hang around there? What about Fagon and John Connington? Was Tyrion going to do an end around and come back with them? It's definitely a different book at this time. And so it's November, and A Storm of Swords has released in the United States. George is out on tour in California, in a place that people live in called Sherman Oaks. A fan reports in from this giant fire hazard and says, I asked GRRM if we would ever see a Cersei POV. He said that he is considering it. He thinks that it would be interesting to write, but that he is not certain that it would be necessary to further the plotline. If it's not necessary, then he probably won't write it. So we're getting a little bit closer to what we know. Cersei's now on the table, but he still doesn't want to add any new POVs. So George doesn't reveal anything really relevant for a couple of months here, until January 31st, when he responds to a fan's question about Brienne.
I am fond of Brienne as well, and I have a lot more in store for her. I'm glad that you've enjoyed the character.
And George goes even darker over the next couple of months as he's deep in the writing process. Eventually, and this isn't on the So Spake Martins, I had to look it up in the A Song of Ice and Fire Yuku. On April 20th, it's reported that there is going to be a George R.R. Martin chat on the AOL Bookkeeper forum. Upon hearing this news, a very distraught fan writes in,
Damn it! I canceled my AOL account!
Goodbye.
Bernie, if you can ask a question, can you ask him what POVs he's decided on for A Dance with Dragons? Originally, he said there would be no new ones, but in another chat, one in which I asked him for a Brienne POV, he would not rule out new POVs and said he had been considering several options, one of which was an entirely new set of POVs, but everyone, including GRRM, found that one highly unlikely.
Why does man kill? He kills for food, and not only food, frequently, there must be a beverage, Woody Allen, without feathers. So I guess we don't know exactly when this chat took place, but it must have been within the preceding months, and something else new was on the table. Possibly Brienne, possibly Asha, Victorian, Aaron, Greyjoy, Zokar, all them. Who knows? He just says possible several options. And then several weeks later, on May 2nd, George tells us that he's having doubts. And then on June 20th, a fan asked George about the writing and hoped that he was enjoying it. George said,
Enjoying? What are you, mad?
No, he didn't say that. He said, enjoying, I don't know. I enjoy having written, but writing can be painful. But I am making progress. And then on August 15th, George chimes back in and says that the book has been pesky, which given what's come before, I'd consider that a bit of an upgrade. Ooh, and he also says he hopes to read a couple chapters from it at PhilCon, which is coming up in just 2 weeks. PhilCon comes on September 1st, and the big announcement is dropped, and the internet hears about it at 7:10 p.m. in some time zone. I'll let those who took notes tell y'all about the 2 chapters George read, but I thought I'd get the ball rolling by posting 2 big pieces of news. First, he has scrapped the 5-year gap. Second, there will probably be 2 new POVs. And then guest comes in 2.5 hours later and says the 4th new book will be named A Feast for Crows, and will cover what would have been the 5-year gap. Some POVs, who would have been learning during the 5-year gap, will have only 1 or 2 chapters. The first new POV is Cersei. The second chapter he read was Tyrion's, and the identity of the other new POV is something he's keeping a secret for now, but he did say it's a character with a story to tell that can't really wait. My money is on the Hound. And if you're looking for a place to weather that there .com crash, I'd recommend a safe energy security called Enron. But most fans at the time speculated that it was Brienne, and for all intents and purposes, it seems like that was what it was. And fans were excited to get these new chapters, although it would cool down a little bit with what would happen 9 days later. And there wasn't a whole lot of new news in the coming months, until ironically a year to the day that post came out saying that George was considering a whole new set of POVs, it was revealed that the Mega Prologue was on. The Mega Prologue was a series of all the new Martell and Greyjoy POVs that George was originally going to condense into like a 250-something page prologue, but eventually George decided that he couldn't fit everything into that sort of a structure, so he ended up breaking it apart, and that's where all the Greyjoy Martell POVs come from within the regular story. And then many months later, on August 23rd, George reads the Captain of the Guards chapter for the first time, Arrow Hotas. He also reveals for the first time one of the major problems with the 5-year gap was the situation going down in Dorne. He felt like it needed a lot more immediacy, which honestly it did. It's kind of weird for nothing to have happened down there and then show like the fallout from Oberyn's death 5 years later. And so, I think we've gone deep enough. You want to talk about House Tyrell? So we're going to do that now, because that's why you're really here, isn't it? Has George ever said that he's written for a fully fledged POV character that he's started out to write and then decided to cut it? As far as I can find, no. And I've talked to a bunch of fans about this, but it doesn't seem like anybody's ever asked him or he hasn't come out and discussed it. But back a long time ago when George was doing a small podcast on his website, he did talk about the prologue of Pate in A Feast for Crows, which I'm just gonna let George tell you about.
You'll see from the samples that the prologue is from the viewpoint of a character named Pate. I actually wrote it from several other viewpoints at various points. Pate had a different name in the earliest take, and then I decided it shouldn't be Pate, it should be Molander, and then I decided no, it shouldn't be Molander, it should be Rosie, the serving wench. So I wrote a version that had her in it, seeing these characters from the outside. And For a while I thought that was working, and then I decided, no, that wasn't working at all. So I went back to Pate.
And you really did kind of need to be in Pate's head for that chapter, because while there wasn't drama between any particular houses, the main driving force of that chapter was House Penis. And you did need to be inside Pate's head to make Rosie appear more riveting. So I think in going back on this timeline, sometime around probably November to the summer of 2001, it was reasonable to assume George had explored somewhere in their additional POVs, maybe that he had just mused in his head, or also possibly written partial chapters of, or maybe a chapter or two that eventually got cut. So let's look back at the landscape at the end of A Storm of Swords. When you don't have a Cersei POV and George is exploring several new options, I think one of the more likely candidates to have made it would have been Margaery, especially considering this is the 5-year gap. It's not the Westeros you think you know. Margaery is no longer 17, she's 22, and Tommen in A Feast for Crows was 9 years old, but in this version he would have been 14. Margaery could have been a much more savvy political player, and the faction of the Tyrells putting pressure on Cersei, having probably delayed Tommen's wedding for so long, would have made for an interesting read. I mean, Margaery's definitely there in A Feast for Crows, but you couldn't imagine her being more than a complementary POV to Cersei's, because she's not on the small council and she can't get close to anything. But if her and Tommen were both 5 years older, you could see how she would have more room to maneuver and could act, instead of just being a complement to Cersei's chapters, being almost a total substitute, maybe. Kind of like a redux to Sansa's chapters, coming from a place where she has more authority and power and able to actually make something happen, whereas Sansa was unable to. In fact, I'd say a lot of what they did in Game of Thrones in Season 5 and Season 6 might have actually come from ideas that George had originally had for Margaery before the 5-year gap was cut. You know, Tommen, he just gets aged up immediately in the show, like 10 years. Back after Season 3, when D&D and Brian Cogman went down to Santa Fe to sit with George for a whole week, I doubt that they were actually sitting down and talking with George for like 10 hours every single day. You know, I don't know what it's like being a writer out on location, but as an auditor, you go to locations to get primary source documents, and get things that you wouldn't normally have ease of access to. George probably wouldn't like a lot of these documents floating out in the ether away from his office, because you know they could be accidentally stolen, or one of the writers from said meetings could go to the airport and accidentally leave them on their laptop at the security terminal. I got you. So yeah, Margaery in a post-5-year gap world is a much stronger substitute for Cersei. And Olenna and Mace also make interesting possibilities, but I don't really want to explore those here, because I think there's something much more interesting. But to do that, we're gonna have to go on a little journey, so hold on to your tinfoil cap, you special blood orange, as we head down to Dorne. Do you remember your first read of A Feast for Crows, before you reread it and reread it until you liked it? I actually liked it a lot on my first read, but there was something that was a little different about it. You start off in the prologue, and it's like a traditional prologue. You're a little less familiar with the character. Then you go to the Iron Isles, and you meet Aeron for the first time as your POV, and you're like, okay, I remember Aeron. This is fun. He's a little weird. And then you go down to Dorne, and you have the Captain of the Guards chapter. And you're like, what? I've never even heard about Aerohota. Are we still in the prologue? This place with the water gardens? What? This doesn't feel like what I thought Dorne would be like. I can't even remember hearing about the water gardens. And if you didn't, you would be right, because the water gardens were never mentioned in any other book before. In fact, it doesn't even appear on the regular maps. The logical place that you would have gone would have been Sunspear, which we've heard about 18 times before. And yeah, technically the water gardens are part of Sunspear because they're only 10 miles outside of town. But what if they were 20 or 30 or 40 or 50? It wouldn't make any kind of a difference because they're a totally separate location. You would have thought, given what George, as I talked about before, with like different POVs leading into other chapters, there's a connectivity tissue there that gives the reader something to latch onto. Without knowing about Aerohota, the location becomes rather important for bridging that gap for the reader. And this is something George normally does, because when you first meet Crescent, you've already heard about Dragonstone 29 times before. When you go with Arya to Braavos, the first thing that she sees in there is the Titan of Braavos that you heard about 4 times before. And when you jump down with Pate, you've already heard about the Citadel 41 times. Now yeah, the Quill and Tankard is not the Citadel, but I'd argue that any place off campus that would be like part of the university's like culture and the local hangout is just as much as part of the Citadel as anywhere. You know, it would probably upset a lot of the Maester alumni if they decided to tear a place like that down. Although it's okay, Lacledes wasn't that great anyway. The place to go was always Humps, with Tuesday night trivia and penny pitcher Wednesdays. So many memories. God damn it! What are we talking about? Oh yeah, we're over in Old Town. Hey, while we're in Old Town, let's talk about Lord Leighton Hightower. He's mentioned a couple of times in the previous books, but this is the first time that we actually get somebody close to him, with Sam. And here we learn he's been holed up at the top of the Hightower for the past decade. The one captain that Sam meets up with just sort of like writes him off as a kook. And while the captain is a big misogynist, you'd think they'd be a lot more angry about him not doing anything. It's not that it doesn't work here, and it's not like there's not going to be a payoff in the next book, but it's not a dynamic that you feel would normally be attributed to a ruler that's been holed up. And if you want to put that tinfoil hat on, there's a place where this would have actually fit, as far as like more of a rough draft of the story. Obara San, daughter of Oberyn Martell, I fight for Dorne, who do you fight for? Thousands are crossing the sands afoot to climb the boneway so may help Mellario bring my father home. The sets are packed to bursting and the red priests have lit their temple fires. In the pillow houses, women are coupling with every man who comes to them and refusing any coin. In Sunspear, on the broken arm, along the green blood, in the mountains, out in the deep sand, everywhere, women tear out their hair and men cry out in rage. The same question is heard on every tongue. What will Doran do? What will his brother do to avenge our murdered prince? She moved closer to the captain. And you say he does not wish to be disturbed?
He does not wish to be disturbed.
You could understand it if this characterization of Leighton Hightower was originally, because it was never mentioned in any book before, over in George's earlier chapters for Dorne, where Doran is holed up inside the Sunspear and nobody is able to contact him and he's reclusive, which is exactly how they feel about him. It makes sense, although it might not be true, I have no idea. But if this were true, then it would make sense why that was moved over to Old Town instead of being here in Dorne. Because if you have it here, then you can't do the chapter down at the Water Gardens. And now we've come full circle. So why did George decide that he'd rather set the chapter down here at the Water Gardens?
Maybe going down to Dorne, George just anticipated that we'd expect to see sand, and going to Sunspear, and so maybe he just wanted to subvert our expectations. I don't know.
But we do know, because it's a much better chapter here than cooped up in the Sunspear. That rhyme was entirely unintentional, I'm sorry. But what's George doing down here with the writing in the Water Gardens? Well, the blood oranges falling from the trees symbolizes the falling members of his house. It provides the chapter with a sense of motion and imagery and scents and sounds that give it life, which otherwise it would just be a chapter of stagnation. You've got a lord who is horribly crippled by gout, fighting through the physical pain every day, much like he feels wretched by the death of his sister Elia and now his brother. He's out in the open, yet unable to move freely physically, much like he's unable to move politically because Dorne does not have the resources of the other kingdoms, such as the Lannisters, who can maneuver out in the open with nearly unlimited wealth. When he commands Obara to look at the kids, it's because he knows that almost everything here could end up getting destroyed by what they're about to do. He knows that Dorne has really terrible odds, yet despite that, for his family and for his honor, he's chosen to fight anyway. Much like father, like son. And don't tell me that Quentin is still alive. If there's one thing George loves, it's a character who goes into a situation thinking they're going to win, realizing they've made a horrible mistake, fighting anyway, and then losing. That's why you can hardly pry him away from the theater when there's a 35mm print in of a new Quentin Tarantino film. Have you seen a Quentin Tarantino film? They all look like this! So we know why he set the chapter at the Water Gardens. I guess the better question to ask would be where? Where did he get this idea? I guess it's entirely possible that George sat down one day and was like,
you know, I really shouldn't set the chapter up here at the Sunspear. I think it would work better if I found a nice open place that would provide a nice characterization for Doran and also provide a nice contrast of the calm before the storm. And I think a good place for that would be doing it at a palace that's also a garden. I think that would make a lot of sense.
And so George could have just pulled it out of air like that, although it would probably be a bit more complicated. But I've got a different idea. It might not be a better idea, but it's definitely a sexier idea.
You might be able to tell where I'm going with this. From a place that more embodied a garden with the crippled lord, and a very memorable location we've all heard of. Of course, I'm talking about Old Oak. No, I'm talking about Highgarden, of course.
Yes, what I'm suggesting is that there was some sort of rough draft pre-end-up chapter or some sort of musing in George's head, maybe he didn't even write it down, that ended up inspiring the location of the Water Gardens.
Now, I don't know if this ever existed or is right or not. And I don't mean to sit here and write fake fan fiction about what such a chapter would entail. I think 4 things, though, are probably pretty safe to talk about. You could imagine that Willis would probably be more the opposite of Doran. While Doran wanted to remain in paradise for as long as possible and relish in the moment, Willis probably would have not wanted to be stuck in the garden. Kind of like Bran's chapters after the accident. You know, the POV that gave George the whole idea to write the saga in the first place.
Or, you know, this is kind of the thing. We don't know entirely what Willis's character is like. Different characters talk about him at different times. Sansa talks about him playing around with puppies. Littlefinger says he's good-natured. Maybe it's not like that. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe Willis actually wants to stay in the garden, but he doesn't have the desire for revenge after his fight with Oberyn. Maybe he thinks that all the conflict between these houses is just a little crazy and he wants to stay away from it and maybe embody what the original first read that you're supposed to get of Doran's chapter is, that he's trying to preserve everything for the Seven Kingdoms. There are multiple ways of looking at this. That's why it's not something where I want to go too deep into what it might be like. I mean, would Willis even be the POV? Probably not. It would probably be somebody more mobile like Garland, or maybe Willis, but I think Garland would be a higher chance. I mean, you can contrast his POV versus Arohota's character, who's way more stoic. With somebody like Garland interacting with Willis, it would have been more of a brotherly connection, more personal.
2 brothers. They have a strong bond. You don't want to know about it here. But I'll tell you one thing. The blood oranges of the Martells, they're really great symbolism. But you can imagine that it took a while for George to arrive at that. And if you had a chapter over here at Highgarden, you could have a more on-the-nose prototype version of that, where like Willis is watching the wilting golden roses with the coming winter.
I mean, it just seems if you were going to set a chapter at Highgarden and you were going to imagine it in your mind's eye, you would see wilting golden roses in the late fall, and that it just has to be thought of with the location. And then George sitting there and developing it, writing the book and thinking about more things, it just develops into this idea that means so much more when it becomes the image for House Martell, and it has more motion and sense and gives that chapter life, and it becomes much more than the lame version that you would have started out with.
I don't know if this in particular is right. The blood oranges just seems like a very developed idea, not something that you would think about, I guess, exactly if you were sitting down and imagining like a chapter at the Water Gardens. Although maybe there's something in George's past where he's like at a place in Florida and he's like, oh yes, oranges. Look, I'm not suggesting that this would have been a direct predecessor to the Water Gardens chapter, where George would have rewrote it until he liked it. Because the interactions in the Water Gardens are totally different. And the style of the Water Palace is very Moorish, whereas Highgarden is probably more traditional European. But he could have put it on the shelf and then restarted the chapter, maintaining the same core concepts. There's also another piece of evidence for this in the So Spake Martins, although it's very bad, but it still warrants discussion because it is mysterious.
In 2006, after A Feast for Crows came out, George was asked a question about how he remembers all these obscure characters. He says he probably won't remember signing your book, because he doesn't remember faces very well, but he does remember obscure characters, like the captain of the guard in Highgarden.
I have a question. Who is the captain of the guard at Highgarden? Turns out it's Egon Veerwell, a character in a place that he's never written anything published before at all. I mean, probably this is just because he's writing the Mystery Knight around this time, and there are 2 Veerwells that are in that story that have like one line or something and a couple of actions. So maybe he remembers it from there. But Egon is basically the counterpart to Arohota, who would eventually become the POV at the Water Gardens. It's not like George has a perfect memory of obscure characters in the appendix, even those that he's written for. Just as poor Turnip.
But we stayed on Highgarden long enough, and there'll be more with Highgarden later. I mean, if we're musing that there is going to be a theoretical Tyrell POV here, then there'd have to be one somewhere else later on, too. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a reason to give that character a chapter. Unless, of course, you're Ares Oakhart, where you can get away with one. So where would a chapter after Highgarden take place? Well, let's assume that some of the characters who would eventually get POVs in the 5-year gap, George would have started thinking about how to tell their story. Maybe they would have tied in. All we can do is try and project it based upon what we know already from A Feast for Crows. I mean, a lot of this could be different, but the first place to look at would be Moat Cailin, where Victarion is presumably sitting on his ass for 5 years. Asha is also probably still chilling out at Deepwood Mott, hiding away from her vicious uncle who seized control of the Iron Isles in the last book. And back on Great Wick, the Prophet is struggling to remain relevant. He's gone underground and started a short-term web series called The Resistance with Theron Greyjoy. And because we're in the 5-year gap, there can't be a Kingsmoot, because that would have been 5 years ago. It wouldn't make sense for Aeron to leave his radio show because it sucked, and then call for a recount, which moves us forward to the Reaver and the taking of the Shield Islands. So let's recap what happened there. The Greyjoys move against the Shields. Euron sends his fastest longships, captained by Browntooth and the oarsmen, and tasks them with sailing straight up the Mander. And then when they get there, they're going to turn around. The defenses of the Shield Islands see the Ironborn fleet, and they're like, oh my god, lol, Ironborn, let's go get him. And they chase after him. And then Euron attacks out of the sunset with the entire rest of the fleet off sea. The Shield Islands fleet says, oh my god, we have made a horrible mistake, and they come back. Victarion and the Greyjoy fleet are now waiting for them at the mouth of the Mander. And they're like, oh, we gotta push through! And they try, and they suck, and they die. And then the Greyjoys throw the biggest party on Oakenshield the South has ever seen. Ain't no party like an Ironborn party. Well, what would this look like in a 5-year gap? Well, Victarion wouldn't be your POV yet, so you gotta get somebody there. You can do that with just a little tweak to the Reaver chapter. You have our memorable location of Old Oak. When they see the Greyjoys approaching, they send a raven. They're like, oh my god, lol, Ironborn, we need help, because we're Old Oak and we're really scared of like 10 ships. It's not 10 ships, it's 1,000 ships. And so any Tyrells at Highgarden could ready what fleet they have to send down the Mander. And they can get there pretty fast, because you should know traveling downriver, even a slow river like the Mander, can greatly enhance the speed of a ship. So they get down there very quickly, by the time the Shield Islands fleet needs to turn around. And then they engage him at the mouth of the Mander. You can have a Tyrell POV be your person who engages him, and maybe cuts Victarion with a sword that gives him an infect. Hey, wait a minute. This is exactly like kind of what happened. Except it wasn't a Tyrell. It was Talbert Serry. And we know Talbert Serry isn't a Tyrell because the Tyrells have a sigil with the golden rose on a green field, and the Serrys have an embattled white rose on a red field. They're definitely very dissimilar. Even when I first read this chapter, I was like, this guy reminds me of Loras. Maybe, I guess Loras just couldn't get there. Maybe he was a slow Loras. I mean, early in the writing for A Dance with Dragons, George could have done this way. And then instead of having Garland or slow Loras get killed, then they go with the Greyjoys to the party, and they could either take the place of Aeron on Euron's ship, or the Tyrell POV could take the place of the Dusky Woman. I mean, not literally as the Dusky Woman, but our captain has got this thing, and it's effing golden. He's not just gonna give it away for nothing. And then even in the chapter, Victarion wants to have pulled Serry out of the water to offer back to Highgarden for a ransom. Vic could have carried Garland all the way to Meereen. You know, it'd be entirely within Victarion's character to give Dany a gift of a man from a better house, who's smarter than him, and better looking, and then offer his own hand in marriage. So yeah, George could have originally written this for a Tyrell, and then with the changes of the 5-year gap, he could have slapped a Goron tunic on him, and give him a name that sounds like it belongs on a tub of ice cream, and call it a day. Hey, what happened to Garland anyway? He's in King's Landing for a tiny bit, but he didn't have any lines, and then he goes back to press his claim at Brightwater Keep. And last we heard about him, when the 1,000 ships attacked the Shield Islands, he was rallying troops to mount a potential counterattack against the Shields. Hey, maybe Garland is the dusky woman. Although I don't know how that works. Maybe Victorian just has really bad eyesight. I don't know, I'm gonna back off that one real fast. So we've got the potential arc here over at the Shields. But there is another potential arc, namely down in Dorne. But this is where madness really lies, and it's on shaky ground. But there is some stuff that's interesting here, so I'm gonna cover it anyway. Namely, it has to do with Doran's relationship with his wife. It's me, Mellario! I told you there was madness. If you can recall in Feast, Mellario and Doran are more or less, they're separated. They aren't divorced because divorces aren't common, but they are estranged. Mellario lives over in Norvos, having left Sunspear, Doran, and their kids. This all came to a head after Doran agreed to foster their son Quentin away with the Ironwoods. While overall George did an amazing job writing the entire Dornish arc, if there is one criticism that I would have of it, it's that this relationship itself isn't entirely explained, especially given that you are seeing everything through the eyes of Arohota. As Mighty Isabel would call it, an exploratory POV, an experiment, where he's like this person who's really close to Doran, but he's not inside of his head, so you kind of get his explanations of what he's doing for reread through the idea of doing a secret service type of person who notices all the little tiny details that are happening around him. So when you go back and you reread it, you notice these things, but you don't get the characterization very well for Doran's marriage. And George answered a fan's questions about this once in Barcelona, where he gave a lengthy explanation about why Doran and Mellario originally got married, and it was because that they had an attraction to something new and exotic and they fell in love. That's not entirely explained in the story. And while this might not be entirely fleshed out, it is clear in the story why they had a falling out. But if we go back to the 5-year gap, however, you'd probably be surprised to learn that Mellario would probably appear in Dorne. That's because in A Storm of Swords, it doesn't appear that this relationship existed yet. In fact, there is reason to believe that it was everything to the contrary. The only time that Mellario gets mentioned is in a conversation that Tywin has. And normally it wouldn't mean anything, except the conversation that they're having, it's the one where Tywin is being a batch and is trying to sell Cersei off as a broodmare to whoever is going to be the most important male suitor to help beflourish their house. And as Tywin is listing the names of potential suitors for Cersei, Tywin writes Doran completely off as being ill-suited for Cersei because Doran is wed to a woman who is younger than him and likely to outlive him. It should have come up in this conversation that Doran was mostly separated from his wife. Tywin is exploring the possible options to them of who Cersei could eventually marry, and to just completely write it off when he should know because they've been separated for like 10 years, and that news should have traveled around. It's not like Doran is completely implausible as a potential suitor. Tywin could write down to Doran and see if he was interested, and Doran could write the High Septon and ask for an annulment, and Tywin, from his end, could probably entice the High Septon to make that happen, even though it's very rare. Maybe George just didn't want to lock himself into this arc here, even though he had already thought of it, so he decided not to mention it. Maybe it got cut out in the editing as the book grew too big and it wasn't too crucial to the scene, or maybe, I think the most likely case is George just hadn't thought of doing this yet. So where'd George get the idea to do this? Well, he probably just came up with it for this story and decided to add it in. That makes complete sense, and I don't think there's any reason to go beyond that. But if you want to, like, pull that tinfoil hat way down past your ankles, you could puzzle out some sort of strange, bizarre Montague-Capigue relationship between Garland and Aerion, taking the place of Aerys Oakheart, with Garland having the fallout with his wife Lynette Fossaway, who we met before in the previous book. And then Aerys Oakheart doesn't become a one-off chapter, which George said he kind of regrets making Aerys a POV character. So if it came from like a longer extended arc somewhere, probably not this one. I think if George ever thought of this idea, he probably would have like canned it in like 10 minutes because it just doesn't work. But I think the idea that he might have or something like it or something similar, it raises a question of how tumultuous was the 5-year gap? Like, how different could things have really been? How many changes, how many rewrites, how many characters, how many stories, how many plots, how many characterizations, how much changed? How many different versions of things did he approach? It could have potentially driven a person crazy. So when George said that the writing at that time was painful, I think he was probably very lost as far as what direction to take the story until he decided to can the gap. You know, we like to talk about the 5-year gap in the context of what it would mean for the characters, what would it mean for the events, what would it mean for the story, what would it meant for House Tyrell. But one of the things that we don't really talk about is what it would have meant for the author. Even if George could have overcome the problems that he was facing when he decided to get rid of the gap, you think of so many different things that he could change in the future of the course of a book and alter different events to take place at different times and different characterizations and different story elements. Add into that the idea of being able to change things all the way 5 years into the past, rearranging entire stories, plots, where characters are, how they feel, what's going on. It would drive him absolutely mad. The book may have never even come out. I mean, it drove me mad, looking back at the different stories for House Tyrell. You didn't even see the image that I made of Darkstar from a cut section. Oh my god, what have I done? But just as there were changes to this video, and the struggles that I had, George has insurmountably more struggles in writing his book because they're way more complicated than this video. There's this one quote from George, and you probably heard it. It's fairly famous at this point, but I'm going to read it anyway.
I think there are 2 types of writers, the architects and the gardeners. The architects plan everything ahead of time, like an architect building a house. They know how many rooms are going to be in the house, what kind of roof they're going to have, where the wires are going to run, what kind of plumbing there's going to be. They have the whole thing designed and blueprinted out before they even nail the first board up. The gardeners dig a hole, drop in a seed, and water it. They kind of know what seed it is. They know if they planted a fantasy seed, or a mystery seed, or whatever. But as the plant comes up and they water it, they don't know how many branches it's going to have. They find out as it grows. And I'm much more a gardener than an architect.
The first time that George ever gave this speech, it was about a month after the release of A Feast for Crows. And I'm fairly confident in my research that George had never given it before. And this might just be another faulty conclusion in a long line of faulty conclusions. I would find it funny if the reason that this speech exists is because that he originally built Highgarden. He was the architect. And then as the gardener, he decided to take that chapter and move it down in the construction to become the Water Gardens. That would be very funny. And a definite wink wink. Although I'm not sure if that's true, and I'm not sure if any of this is true. Well, if there's one thing that you take away from this video, don't take away from it anything that I might have come up with here is anything that's right, because I have no idea. But if you do take away one thing, it should be an appreciation for all of the different struggles and different ways and things that George has to go through in writing these books as the gardener. So as he's holed up in the Fortress of Solitude riding the winds of winter, be nice to George, because some of this stuff is really painful. That's not to say that it's all painful, and George is a special guy. At some points, the pain might be a little bit pleasurable too for him, because it is interesting. There are some people that say that George has lost interest in writing A Song of Ice and Fire because he knows the ending, and the show's gonna get there. And there's this bad quote that was taken out of context because it comes from the 1993 Waterstone letter that was originally sent in to his publishers when he was designing the book. The stupid quote is,
"If I know exactly where a book is going, I lose all interest in writing it."
And people use this to say, oh, he isn't writing the books at all. That's not true, and that's not true at all. He probably does procrastinate quite a bit, and he probably has a lot of distractions that always keep growing as he's kept getting more famous. Like, that's a problem, and George is a really nice guy. It's hard for him to say no to people who come to him with stuff. But here's the thing. This quote is taken horribly out of context, because what it's part of is the original speech that he gave before he came up with the architect and the gardener speech. And I know this because it's in the interview that I began this video with, and I'm going to play that excerpt for you and perfectly bookend this whole thing, so you understand exactly what George was talking about and why he enjoys the series. It's because of stuff like this and building and constructing the series. so that we might all enjoy it.
Well, I was wondering if you sit down and do a detailed outline and plan for each book for the whole series,
No.
or do you just let it kind of grow in your head?
I do not. I have some notes. I have a rough idea of where the series is going. I know kind of the ultimate fate of most of the major characters and how the thing is going to end, but I don't know every twist and turn of the road that's going to take me there. I discover that in the writing, and I think that's what gives the writing immediacy and interest. And
that act of creation is what fuels your interest in doing the project.
Yes,
and if you
yes.
spend that energy on the outline, you don't have it for the thing the reader's going to see.
I think I'd be very bored if I outlined everything very thoroughly and knew everything I was going to write. Then it would just sort of be filling in the blanks when I actually sat down to do it, and it would be kind of a boring and onerous task that I would quickly lose interest in. Because deciding those things is the most fun part of writing, the most imaginative part.